In the fog of 1925 London, a brilliant journalist, Clara Henshaw, is found dead. Her explosive diary packed with secrets of a corporate scandal. Was it suicide or murder? Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, unraveling a web of ambition, envy, and fear. For suspects, her editor, her source, her rival, her roommate hide a motive, but only one holds the truth. A scratched desk, a torn note, a stained coat. The clues point to a killer desperate to bury Clara's secrets. Can Miss Marple find the diary's shadow before it's too late? Chapter 1. The empty desk in the serene village of St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with summer's last roses and the church clock ticked with unhurried precision. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the bay window. Her nimble fingers worked a pair of knitting needles, coaxing pale pink wool into the delicate pattern of a shawl, but her sharp blue eyes were not on the stitches. They gazed outward, past the lace curtains, to the quiet lane where the postman's bicycle wobbled under the weight of gossip as much as letters. It was a peaceful scene, yet Miss Marple's mind was restless, stirred by a letter that had arrived that morning from her nephew, Inspector Raymond, west of Scotland Yard. The letter, written in Raymond's hurried hand, spoke of a troubling case in London. Clara Henshaw, a young journalist of some repute, had been found dead in her Bloomsbury flat, her body discovered on her bed with an empty bottle of sleeping pills nearby. The police had concluded suicide, but Raymond's instincts, honed by years of untangling human misdeeds, suggested otherwise. More curious still, Clara's diary, a leather-bound volume she was never seen without, had vanished. She recorded everything in it Raymond had written. Interviews, leads, secrets. Too dangerous to print. If it's gone, someone took it, and I'd wager my badge it's tied to her death. He had ended with a plea. Would his dear Aunt Jane lend her singular insight to the puzzle? Miss Marple, though fond of her tranquil village life, felt a familiar spark at the challenge. She had a knack for seeing what others missed. A gift born not of detective training, but of observing the small dramas of St. Mary Mead, the jealousies, the secrets, the lies that hid behind polite smiles. By noon, she had packed a modest suitcase, her knitting tucked carefully inside, and boarded the train to London, her mind already turning over the sparse facts like a gardener inspecting soil. Raymond met her at Paddington Station, his face a mixture of relief and worry. "You're a marvel, Aunt Jane," he said, taking her suitcase. "This case is a tangle, and the Yard's ready to close it." As they drove through London's bustling streets, he briefed her further. Clara Henshaw, aged 30, had been a rising star at the Clarion, a newspaper known for its bold exposes. Her latest investigation, rumoured to involve a powerful corporation, had made her enemies. She was fearless, Raymond said, but perhaps too fearless. Her diary was her weapon, and now it's gone. They arrived at Clara's flat, a second-floor affair in a Georgian building off Russell Square. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of ink and old books. The sitting room, which doubled as Clara's study, was a chaos of papers, typed articles, scribbled notes, and clippings pinned to a corkboard. A sturdy oak desk stood by the window, its surface cluttered with a typewriter, a chipped teacup, and a stack of unopened letters. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the absence of the diarist weight among the mess. She never left it lying about, Raymond confirmed, running a hand through his hair. It was always with her or locked away. Miss Marple approached the desk, her movements slow but deliberate, like a cat stalking a shadow. She ran a finger along the edge, feeling a faint scratch in the wood, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. "Interesting," she murmured, her voice soft as the rustle of her tweed skirt. She turned to the mantel, where a single photograph caught her eye. It showed Clara, her dark hair framing a determined face, standing with 3 others: a stern man in a tailored suit, a nervous-looking woman with pinched features, a young man with sharp cheekbones and a guarded smile, and a quiet-looking girl with paint-stained fingers. "Who are they?" Miss Marple asked. Raymond stepped closer. "Her inner circle, or so we think. Victor Grayson, her editor at the Clarion Ambitious, runs a tight ship. Evelyn Moore, her source, a secretary at Thorn Industries, the company Clara was investigating. Leonard Tate, her rival at the paper, always chasing her scoops. And Margaret Poole, her roommate, an artist who keeps to herself. They're the only ones Clara mentioned in her last letters to her sister." Miss Marple studied the photograph, her mind drifting to a St. Mary Mead grocer who'd once smiled for a village fete picture while hiding a pilfered cash box. Faces, she knew, could conceal as much as they revealed. Did she trust them? She asked. Raymond hesitated. She trusted no one completely, not even Margaret. Her work made her cautious, but these 4 were close to her, in one way or another. If the diary's gone, one of them might know why. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking faintly. In her bag, as she moved to the window, the street below was alive with London's humcabs honking, pedestrians hurrying, but her thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of Clara's life. A missing diary, a dead journalist, and 4 suspects, each with their own motives. She recalled a village scandal years ago, when a stolen recipe book had led to a bitter feud. The diary, she sensed, was more than a record. It was a key to a truth someone was desperate to hide. "Raymond, dear," she said, turning to him with a serene smile, "I think I shall need a cup of tea and a list of these 4 people's addresses. We have work to do." As Raymond scribbled the details, Miss Marple's eyes returned to the scratched desk, her mind already weaving a pattern from the threads of suspicion. Clara Henshaw's death was no accident, and the diary's absence was the first clue in a game of shadows. In St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of surfacing, and Miss Marple was determined to see this one brought to light. Chapter 2. The editor's ambition. Miss Jane Marple. Her small suitcase settled in the modest Bloomsbury guest house where she would stay, felt the pulse of London's ceaseless energy beyond her window. The city, with its clamour of motor cars and the distant chime of Big Ben, was a far cry from the gentle rhythms of St. Mary Mead. Yet human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere, veiled in sophistication or simplicity. It betrayed itself in the smallest gestures. Her nephew, Inspector Raymond West, had arranged for her to meet Victor Grayson, Clara Henshaw's editor at the Clarion, that very afternoon. "He's a man who likes control," Raymond had warned, handing her a slip with Grayson's office address. But Clara was his star, and he's not pleased about her death. Thor, the missing diary. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked into her capacious handbag, nodded thoughtfully. Control, she mused, was often a mask for fear, and fear could lead to desperate acts. The offices of the Clarion occupied a grand building on Fleet Street, its stone facade etched with the confidence of an institution that shaped public opinion. Miss Marple, in her unassuming tweed coat and sensible hat, might have seemed out of place among the sharp-suited reporters and typists clattering at their machines. But her serene demeanour carried an authority that parted the bustle like a gentle wave. A young secretary, her lipstick a vivid red, led Miss Marple to the top floor, where Victor Grayson's office overlooked the city's rooftops. The room was a study in power, polished mahogany desk, leather-bound books lining the walls, and a window framing St. Paul's dome against a grey sky. Grayson himself, a man in his late 40s with steel-grey hair and a jawline that suggested both resolve and obstinacy, rose to greet her. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but Miss Marple noted the faint creases around his eyes, the mark of a man who slept poorly. "Miss Marple, is it?" Grayson said, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. "Inspector West mentioned you're assisting with Clara's case. I must say, I'm surprised the Yard thinks an amateur's insight necessary." His tone was polite, but the edge of condescension was unmistakable. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes bright with the innocence of a St. Mary Mead spinster, though her mind was already cataloguing his words. Men like Grayson, she recalled, were not unlike Mr. Hargreaves, the village banker who'd once dismissed her concerns about a forged check until she'd proven him wrong. "I'm merely an old woman with a fondness for puzzles," she said, settling into the chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them out. "Clara Henshaw was a remarkable journalist, I understand. Her loss must be keenly felt here." Grayson's expression softened, but only slightly. "She was exceptional," he said, leaning back in his chair and lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled upward, catching the light from a brass lamp. "Clara had a nose for a story too good, sometimes. Her pieces on political corruption last year doubled our readership. But she was headstrong, always chasing the next big scandal without a thought for the consequences." He exhaled, his eyes narrowing. "I warned her to be careful, but she wouldn't listen." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. "Consequences, Mr. Grayson, for whom?" Her voice was gentle, but the question hung in the air like the smoke from his cigarette. Grayson shifted, his fingers brushing the edge of a silver cigarette case. "For herself, of course," he said quickly, "and for the Clarion. A newspaper lives or dies by its reputation. Clara's stories stirred up trouble, lawsuits, threats, powerful enemies. Thorn Industries, for one, wasn't pleased with her poking about their finances." He tapped ash into a crystal tray, his movements deliberate. "I told her to hold off on her latest piece until we had more evidence. She didn't take it well." Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a St. Mary Mead grocer who'd once argued with his supplier over a risky deal, his bluster hiding a deeper fear of ruin. "You quarreled, then?" she asked, her tone as mild as if she were inquiring about the weather. Grayson's jaw tightened, but he met her gaze. "A professional disagreement, nothing more. 2 days before she died, we had words in this office. She wanted to publish her story on Thorn immediately, claimed she had proof in her diary. I told her it was too dangerous without corroboration. She stormed out, said she'd do it with or without my approval." He stubbed out his cigarette, the gesture abrupt. "That was the last time I saw her." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to the tension in the room. She noted the locked drawer to Grayson's left, its brass key glinting in the lamplight. "Her diary," she said thoughtfully. "I understand. It was never far from her side. Did she ever show it to you?" Grayson shook his head, a touch too quickly. "Never. Clara was secretive about it. Said it was her insurance policy names, dates, things she couldn't publish yet. I didn't press her. A good editor knows when to trust a reporter's instincts." His smile was thin, and Miss Marple observed the way his hand lingered near the drawer, as if guarding a secret of his own. "And where were you, Mr. Grayson, the night Clara died?" she asked, her voice so soft it might have been a passing thought. He blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. "At a dinner with advertisers," he said, recovering smoothly. "The Savoy until nearly midnight. Dozens of witnesses, if you need them." He leaned forward, his tone hardening. "Look, Miss Marple, I don't know what you're fishing for, but I had no reason to harm Clara. She was my best asset. Her death's a tragedy, but it's suicide, plain and simple. The police agree." Miss Marple's smile remained serene, but her eyes were sharp as they met his. "The police are often busy, Mr. Grayson, and sometimes overlook the small things. In my village, a missing letter once solved a theft. A diary, I imagine, could solve much more." She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. "Thank you for your time. I shan't trouble you further for now." As she descended the stairs, the secretary's typewriter clattering in the background, Miss Marple's thoughts turned over Grayson's words. His ambition was palpable, his office a monument to his success. Yet there was a brittleness to him, like a St. Mary Mead solicitor, who'd once hidden a client's fraud to protect his own standing. The locked drawer nagged at her, as did Grayson's quick dismissal of Clara's death. Had he feared her story would bring ruin to the Clarion or to himself? She recalled the photograph in Clara's flat, Grayson's stern face beside Clara's. Vibrant one. Trust, she knew, was a fragile thing, easily broken by greed or fear. Outside, the London air was thick with the scent of coal, smoke and rain. Miss Marple hailed a cab, her mind already planning her next visit to Evelyn Moore, the nervous source who'd fed Clara's investigation. As the cab rattled toward the tea shop where they'd agreed to meet, Miss Marple's fingers traced the outline of her knitting needles, her thoughts weaving a pattern from Grayson's words. A man like him, she mused, would not let a diary's secrets destroy his empire, not without a fight. But had that fight ended in murder? Only the missing diary, she suspected, held the answer. The tea shop, a cosy nook off Chancery Lane, was a contrast to the Clarion's grandeur. Its steamed windows and clinking china offered a semblance of warmth, though Evelyn Moore, seated at a corner table, looked anything but warm. A woman in her early 30s, her mousy brown hair was pinned tightly, and her grey coat seemed chosen to blend into the woodwork. Her eyes darted to the door as Miss Marple entered, her fingers twisting a napkin into knots. "Miss Marple," she whispered, as if the name itself might draw attention. "Inspector West said you wanted to talk about Clara." Miss Marple settled across from her, ordering a pot of Earl Grey with the ease of one accustomed to putting others at ease. "Yes, my dear," she said, her voice soothing. "I'm trying to understand Clara's last days. You were her source, I believe, for a story about Thorn Industries." Evelyn's face paled, her hands trembling as she poured tea. I helped her, yes, but I begged her not to use my name. Thorn's a dangerous company, powerful, ruthless. Clara was digging into their accounts, offshore deals, bribes to officials. I gave her documents, things I found in the files. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said her diary had all the details, proof that could bring them down. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes gentle but unyielding. "And did you ever see this diary, Miss Moore?" Evelyn shook her head, her gaze fixed on the table. "No, she kept it close. She said it was safer that way. I didn't want to know more. I was already in too deep." Her fingers tightened on the napkin, tearing it slightly. "When I heard," She was dead. I thought it was my fault. If I hadn't given her those papers. Miss Marple's expression softened, recalling a St. Mary Mead typist who'd once confessed to hiding a stolen letter out of fear for her job. You mustn't blame yourself, my dear, she said. But tell me, where were you the night Clara died? Evelyn's eyes widened, then dropped. At home, alone. I don't go out much. I was so frightened after talking to Clara that day. I locked my door and stayed in. Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the way her hand shook, not unlike a village girl who'd lied about a broken vase. They spoke a little longer, Evelyn's answers growing shorter, her glances more furtive. As Miss Marple thanked her and rose to leave, she observed the young woman's coat hung on the rack. It was damp, though the day was dry, and a faint stain marked the cuffing, perhaps, or something darker. Miss Marple filed the detail away, her mind turning to a St. Mary Mead gardener who'd once betrayed his guilt with a muddy boot. Evelyn's fear was genuine, but was it fear of discovery or of something worse? Back at her guest house, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Grayson's ambition and Evelyn's terror were two threads in a tangled skein, each pulling at the mystery of Clara's death. The diary, she sensed, was the knot at the center, and its absence spoke louder than any witness. Had Grayson silenced Clara to protect his paper's reputation, or had Evelyn, driven by fear, acted to save herself? The answer, Miss Marple knew, lay in the small things, the locked drawer, the damp coat, the scratch on Clara's desk. In St. Mary Mead, such clues had unravelled many a secret, and London, for all its grandeur, was no different. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving toward her next meeting with Leonard Tate, the rival whose envy might hold another piece of the puzzle. The diary's shadow loomed large, and she was determined to bring its secrets into the light. Chapter 3. The Sources, Secret Miss Jane Marple. Her knitting needles, resting quietly in her lap, sat in the modest sitting room of her Bloomsbury guest house, the gas fire casting a warm glow across the faded chintz curtains. The events of the day, her meeting with Victor Grayson, the ambitious editor, and her brief, fraught encounter with Evelyn Moorhad set her mind spinning, not unlike the wool she wound into neat balls for her shawl. London's ceaseless hum, so different from the gentle rhythms of St. Mary Mead, seemed to carry the weight of secrets, and Miss Marple knew that secrets, like weeds, grew best in the shadows. Evelyn Moore, Clara Henshaw's nervous source, had left her with a sense of unease, her damp coat and trembling hands hinting at more than mere fear. Today, Miss Marple resolved to probe deeper, to meet Evelyn again and unravel the threads of her story. The tea shop off Chancery Lane, where they had first met, was too public for a second conversation, so Miss Marple had sent a note through her nephew, Inspector Raymond West, requesting a meeting at Evelyn's modest flat in Somewhere quiet, my dear, she had written, where we may speak freely. Evelyn had agreed, though her reply, scribbled in a hurried hand, betrayed reluctance. As Miss Marple stepped from the cab into the narrow street, lined with soot-stained brick buildings, she felt the city's pulse quicken, as if it too sensed the gravity of her task. A chill hung in the air, and she drew her shawl closer, her eyes scanning the windows above for signs of watching eyes. Evelyn's flat was on the third floor of a tired tenement, its staircase creaking under Miss Marple's careful steps. The door opened to reveal Evelyn, her face paler than before, her brown hair pinned tightly as if to hold her composure in place. Miss Marple, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I didn't expect. Please, come in. The flat was small, sparsely furnished, with a single armchair by a chipped table and a typewriter perched on a sideboard, its keys silent. A faint smell of lavender polish lingered, as if Evelyn had tried to impose order on her anxious world. Miss Marple noted a stack of papers by the typewriter letters, perhaps, or copies of the documents she'd given Clara. Thank you, my dear, Miss Marple said, settling into the armchair with the ease of one accustomed to making herself at home in any setting. Her handbag rested on her lap, the knitting needles within a quiet promise of patience. I shan't take much of your time, but I felt we had more to discuss. Clara's death has left many questions, and you, I think, may hold some answers. Evelyn's hands twisted together, her knuckles white. I've told you everything, she said, her eyes darting to the window. I gave Clara those papers about Thorn Industries, but I didn't have anything to do with her death. Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple observed the way her gaze flickered, not unlike a St. Mary Mead seamstress who'd once denied hiding a stolen brooch, her eyes betraying her guilt. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, disarming. Of course, my dear. But let us go back a little. You said Clara was investigating Thorn Industries. Quite a formidable company, I understand. You must have been very brave to share such secrets with her. Her tone was warm, encouraging, but her eyes missed nothing, the faint tremor in Evelyn's lip, the way her fingers clutched the edge of her skirt. Evelyn swallowed, sitting stiffly on a wooden chair. I didn't feel brave, she admitted. I was terrified. I'm just a secretary, Miss Marple. I type letters, file reports. But I saw things ledgers that didn't add up, payments to names I didn't recognize, accounts in places like the Caymans. Clara came to me after I let something slip at a pub. She was so determined. She said she could expose them, make things right. Evelyn's voice faltered. I gave her what I could, but I begged her not to use my name. If Thorn found out, I'd lose everything. My job, my home, maybe worse. Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a St. Mary Mead clerk who'd once confessed to passing village gossip to a rival shopkeeper. His fear of discovery written in his fidgeting hands. And Clara's diary, she said softly, did she ever mention what she wrote in it? Names, perhaps, or details of those documents? Evelyn shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. She never showed it to me. She said it was her safeguard, that it had everything, dates, figures, even conversations she'd overheard. She kept it locked in a drawer at home, or so she told me. Her voice grew quieter. After she died, I thought, maybe someone took it to stop her story. Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the tension in the room. And when did you last see Clara, my dear? The day she died, perhaps? Evelyn's face drained of what little colour remained. No, it was the day before. We met at a cafe near Thorn's offices. She was excited, said she was close to finishing her story. I told her to be careful, that Thorn had people watching. She laughed, said she could handle it. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. I should have stopped her. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp, noting the hesitation in Evelyn's words. And that night, Miss Moore, where were you when Clara died? Evelyn's hands froze, her breath catching. I was here, she said, too quickly. I didn't go out. I was so frightened after our meeting. I stayed in, locked the door. Her eyes darted to the typewriter, then back to Miss Marple. I swear I didn't see her again. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes resting on Evelyn's coat, now hung on a peg by the door. The stain on the cuff, noticed yesterday, was still there, dark, possibly ink, but possibly not. She recalled the neighbor's comment about Evelyn's damp coat, mentioned in passing by Raymond on a night when no rain had fallen. "You must have been very worried," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "It's a heavy burden, carrying such secrets. In my village, a young woman once hid a letter that could have ruined her employer. She was frightened, too, but she told the truth in the end." Evelyn's lips trembled, but she said nothing, her silence louder than words. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow, deliberate. "Thank you, Miss Moore. You've been most helpful. I may call again, if you don't mind." As she stepped toward the door, her eyes lingered on the typewriter, where a single sheet of paper protruded, its edge torn as if hastily removed. She made no comment, but her mind filed the detail away, alongside the damp coat and Evelyn's faltering answers. Outside, the Clerkenwell street was growing dark, the gaslights flickering to life. Miss Marple hailed a cab, her thoughts turning over Evelyn's words like a gardener inspecting roots. The young woman's fear was genuine, but fear, she knew, could drive one to desperate acts. Had Evelyn gone to Clara's flat that night? Not to talk, but to silence her. The diary, with its damning secrets, would have been a threat to Evelyn's safety, her livelihood. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead baker who'd once destroyed a ledger to hide his debts, his panic leading to a confession under gentle pressure. Evelyn, she sensed, was not yet ready to confess, but the truth was there, buried in her silences. As the cab rattled toward Bloomsbury, Miss Marple's fingers traced the outline of her knitting needles, her mind weaving a pattern from the dais. Clues. Evelyn's story held gaps, like a poorly darned sock, and the missing diary was the thread that could unravel it all. Had Evelyn taken it, destroyed it, to protect herself from Thorne's wrath, or was she merely a frightened pawn in a larger game? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her next meeting with Leonard Tate, the rival journalist whose envy might hold another key. In St. Mary Mead, envy had once led a shopgirl to sabotage a rival's display, and Miss Marple suspected Leonard's ambitions might be no less dangerous. The guesthouse fire was low when she returned, but Miss Marple's resolve burned bright. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Clara Henshaw's death was no suicide, and the diary's absence was a deliberate act. As the London night deepened, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination, ready to pull the next thread in the tangled skein of murder. Chapter 4. The rivals' envy. The morning mist clung to London's streets as Miss Jane Marple stepped from her Bloomsbury guest house, her sensible hat tilted against the damp air, the city's clamour, newspaper boys shouting headlines, the clatter of milk carts felt distant to her, as if her thoughts were still in St. Mary Mead, where envy and ambition simmered beneath the surface of village pleasantries. Her meeting with Evelyn Moore had left her with a sense of unease. The young woman's nervous silences and that stained, damp coat hinting at secrets yet unspoken. Today, Miss Marple's focus turned to Leonard Tate, Clara Henshaw's rival. At the Clarion, a man whose sharp ambition, she suspected, might cut deeper than professional rivalry. Her nephew, Inspector Raymond West, had arranged a meeting at a pub near Fleet Street, where Leonard was known to linger over a pint and a grudge. The Black Horse was a narrow, smoke-filled establishment, its dark wood panelling and brass fittings gleaming faintly under gaslights. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, drew curious glances from the journalists and clerks who filled the booths, their voices buzzing with the day's scoops. Leonard Tate was easy to spot, a lean figure in a tailored jacket, his sharp cheekbones and restless eyes giving him the look of a fox on the hunt. He rose as she approached, his smile quick but guarded, as if measuring her worth. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a hand. "Inspector West said you're looking into Clara's death. I'll help if I can, but I'm not sure what I can tell you." His voice was smooth, practiced, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed on the table. A nervous tick, not unlike that of a St. Mary Mead lad who'd once lied about a pilfered bicycle. She settled across from him, ordering a pot of tea with the calm assurance of one who found comfort in ritual. "You're very kind to spare the time, Mr. Tate," she said, her voice soft as the rustle of her tweed skirt. "I understand you and Clara Henshaw were colleagues at the Clarion. It must have been a lively place, with two such talented journalists." Leonard's smile tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Lively, yes, Clara was. Exceptional. Always got the big stories, the ones that sold papers. Grayson, our editor, practically worshipped her. Me, I had to scrap for every byline." His tone was light, but the bitterness beneath it was as sharp as a winter wind. Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their gentle clicking a soothing counterpoint to the pub's din. She recalled a St. Mary Mead baker's apprentice, whose envy of a rival's promotion had led to a sabotaged loaf, his resentment plain in his clenched fists. "Competition can be trying," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I imagine Clara's success must have been frustrating at times, especially with her diary holding such valuable leads." Leonard's fingers paused their drumming, his gaze flicking to the pint glass before him. "That diary," he said, with a short laugh, "her secret weapon. She'd scribble in it constantly names, tips, things she wouldn't share with anyone, not even Grayson. Said it was her edge. I didn't need her secrets to do my job, but yes, it stung, watching her land every major story while I chased crumbs." He leaned back, his posture casual, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, like a St. Mary Mead gardener who'd once coveted a neighbor's prize roses. "Did you ever see the diary, Mr. Tate?" she asked, her voice as mild as if she were inquiring about the pub's menu. He shook his head, too quickly. "Never. She kept it close, like it was gold. Locked it in her desk at home, or so she said. I didn't care enough to pry." His words were dismissive, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way his gaze darted to the side. A telltale sign she'd seen in a village shopgirl who'd denied stealing a ribbon. "Clara's stories were her own," he added. "I had my own sources, my own leads." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over his words. "And the night Clara died," she said, her tone gentle. "Where were you, Mr. Tate? It must have been a shock, hearing of her death." Leonard's fingers resumed their drumming, faster now. "I was at a press conference," he said, his voice steady but his eyes wary. "The Home Office, some dull policy announcement. Dozens of reporters. They're all bored out of their minds. I stayed till the end, then came here for a drink. Ask anyone." He produced a crumpled ticket stub from his pocket, sliding it across the table. "Proof, if you need it." Miss Marple glanced at the stub, her fingers brushing its edge. "Very thorough," she said, smiling. "In my village, a young man once kept a ticket to prove he'd been at a fair. but he'd slipped away early to cause mischief. Alibis are such curious things, don't you think? Her tone was light, but her eyes held his, searching for the flicker of unease she knew so well. Leonard's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. No mischief here, Miss Marple. I was where I said I was. Clara's death was a tragedy, but she was reckless, pushed too hard, made enemies. Thorn Industries, for one, they don't take kindly to being sniffed around. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. If you're looking for answers, ask Grayson. He and Clara fought like cats over her last story, or that source of hers, Evelyn something. Shady type, always skulking about. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind filing away his deflection. You're very observant, Mr. Tate, she said. I suppose journalists must be. Did you ever hear Clara mention what her last story was about? He hesitated, his fingers tightening on his glass. Bits and pieces. Something about Thorn Industries offshore accounts. Bribes. The usual corporate rot. She was obsessed, said her diary had proof that it'd bring them down. But she wouldn't share details, not with me. His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darkened, as if the memory stung. She recalled a St. Mary Mead tailor who'd envied a rival's success. His resentment leading to a slashed coat in a fit of spite. And did you ever feel tempted, Mr. Tate, she asked, her voice soft as a whisper, to look at that diary? Perhaps to find a story of your own. Leonard's laugh was sharp, almost a bark. Tempted? Sure. Who wouldn't be? But I didn't need to steal her work. I was offered a job at the Dispatch, better pay, better bylines. I didn't need Clara's scraps. His words were bold, but Miss Marple caught the slight flush in his cheeks, the mark of a man defending his pride. She thought of a St. Mary Mead grocer who'd boasted of a rival offer, only to be caught pilfering to fund his dreams. She rose, tucking her knitting away. Thank you, Mr. Tate. You've been most helpful. I hope I shan't need to trouble you again. As she stepped into the smoky air of the pub, she felt Leonard's eyes on her, heavy with something unspoken. Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking Fleet Street in a grey veil. Miss Marple hailed a cab, her thoughts weaving through Leonard's words. His alibi was solid, backed by the ticket stub and the press conference's public nature. Yet his envy was a living thing, sharp and restless. Had he coveted Clara's diary enough to steal it or worse? She recalled the scratch on Clara's desk, the missing diary's weight in her mind. Envy, she knew, could drive a man to dark deeds, just as it had a St. Mary Mead carpenter who'd sabotaged a rival's work as the cab carried her back to Bloomsbury. Miss Marple's fingers traced the outline of her knitting needles, her mind turning to her next meeting with Margaret Poole, Clara's quiet roommate. Leonard's bitterness was a thread in the tangled skein of Clara's death, but the diary's absence was the knot at its center. Had Leonard's ambition led him to Clara's flat that night, or was he merely a jealous bystander in St. Mary? Mead, small clues, had unravelled great mysteries, and Miss Marple was certain that London's secrets, too, would yield to her patient scrutiny. Chapter 5. The roommate's silence the London afternoon was heavy with the threat of rain. The sky a sullen grey that mirrored the weight of Miss Jane Marple's thoughts as she made her way to Clara Henshaw's flat in Bloomsbury, her meeting with Leonard Tate had left her with a sense of his sharp-edged envy, his quick alibi and restless fingers suggesting a man whose ambition might outstrip his scruples. Yet the missing diary, that elusive key to Clara's death, remained out of reach. Its absence a silent challenge to Miss Marple's keen mind. Today, she sought Margaret Poole, Clara's roommate, a young woman whose quiet demeanor, she suspected, concealed more than it revealed. In St. Mary Mead, the quiet ones often held the deepest secrets, like the village seamstress who'd once hidden a stolen locket behind her shy smiles. The Georgian building on Russell Square stood solid and unassuming, its windows reflecting the gloom. Miss Marple climbed the stairs to the second-floor flat, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm. Margaret answered the door, her slight frame almost lost in a paint-splattered smock, her auburn hair tied loosely back, her eyes a soft hazel held a flicker of wariness, but she offered a hesitant smile. "Miss Marple, Inspector West said you'd come. Please, come in." Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the creak of the floorboards as she led the way inside. The flat was a study in contrasts. Clara's cluttered desk, still untouched since her death, stood in sharp relief against Margaret's orderly corner, where canvases leaned against a wall, their colors muted but deliberate. A faint smell of turpentine hung in the air, mingling with the musty scent of old books. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the photograph on the mantel. Clara, with her editor, source, rival, and this quiet artist, all bound by ties she had yet to unravel. "A charming place," she said, settling into a worn armchair by the window. "You and Clara must have been close, sharing such a space." Margaret's hands fidgeted with a paintbrush, her fingers stained with ochre and blue. "We got on well enough," she said, her voice soft but guarded. Clara was intense. Always working, always writing in that diary of hers. I kept to myself, mostly painting or sketching. She gestured to a canvas nearby, an abstract piece with jagged lines that seemed to pulse with unease. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, recalling AST. Mary Mead girl whose embroidery had betrayed her anxiety after a village theft. Clara's diary, Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. I understand it was very dear to her. Did you ever see it, Miss Poole? Her knitting. Needles emerged, their soft clicking a steady rhythm against the silence. Margaret's eyes dropped to her hands. I saw it, yes. She was always scribbling in it, even late at night. It was leather, dark green, with a little clasp. She kept it on her desk or in her bag, never far from her. Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on the brush, not unlike AST. Mary Mead Baker, who'd gripped his rolling pin when questioned about a missing purse, and the night she died. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but unyielding. Did you see the diary then? Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering to the desk. I don't know. I wasn't here. I was at an art gallery in Soho, a small exhibition. I got back late, after they found her. Her words came slowly, as if each were chosen with care. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the vagueness of the answer. In St. Mary Mead, a young woman's hazy alibi had once unravelled under gentle scrutiny, revealing a tryst she'd wished to conceal. You must have been terribly shocked, Miss Marple said, her eyes kind but searching, to come home and find such a tragedy. Did Clara seem herself that day, or was she troubled? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She was on edge, she admitted, setting the paintbrush down. She'd been like that for days, ever since her last meeting with her Saucervalen, I think. Clara said someone was watching her, following her. She kept checking the locks, looking out the window. I told her to tell the police, but she said she could handle it. Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple observed the way her hands twisted together a gesture that echoed asked. Mary, Mead's shopgirl, who'd hidden her fear behind a nervous laugh. Did she mention her story? Miss Marple asked, her needles resuming their rhythm. The one about Thorn Industries, perhaps. Margaret shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. Not much. She said it was big, that her diary had all the proof she needed. Something about ledgers and bribes. I didn't ask. I didn't want to get involved. Clara's work was dangerous. Her voice was barely a whisper, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush in her cheeks, as if the memory stirred guilt or fear. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow, and approached Clara's desk. The scratch she'd noticed before was still there. A faint mark in the oak, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. She ran a finger along it, her mind drifting to a stat. Mary Mead Carpenter, who'd once left a similar mark while hiding a stolen watch. This desk, she said, almost to herself, it's seen a great deal, hasn't it? Did Clara leave the diary here that night, do you think? Margaret's eyes widened, then dropped. I don't know, she said quickly. I didn't see it when I got back. The police were already here, and everything was a blur. Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way her hand moved to her smock, as if to steady herself. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who'd clutched her apron when questioned about a missing letter. Her guilt plain in the gesture. You've been very kind, Miss Poole, Miss Marple said, her smile warm but her mind alert. May I see Clara's room, perhaps? It might help me understand her last moments. Margaret hesitated, then nodded, leading Miss Marple to a small bedroom off the sitting area. The room was tidy, almost austere, with a narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a bedside table where a bottle of sleeping pills still stood, a grim reminder of the official verdict. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the space, noting the absence of personal touches, no photographs, no trinkets, only a single sketch pinned to the wall. A delicate pencil drawing of a woman's face, hauntingly like Clara's. Did you draw this? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle. Margaret nodded, her expression softening. I did it a few weeks ago. Clara didn't like sitting for it, but I wanted to capture her. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple saw the glimmer of tears, quickly blinked away. She thought of a St. Mary Mead artist who'd painted a portrait to atone for a betrayal. The canvas holding more truth than her words. Thank you, my dear, Miss Marple said, returning to the sitting room. You've given me much to think about. I shan't keep you longer. As she stepped toward the door, her eyes lingered on Margaret's canvas, its jagged lines seeming to pulse with a hidden story. Outside, the rain had begun, a soft patter against the windows, and Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer, her mind weaving through Margaret's silences. The cab ride back to her guest house was quiet, the driver's chatter lost on Miss Marple. As she turned over the day's clues, Margaret's reticence, her vague alibi, and that sketch of Clara spoke of a bond deeper than she'd admitted, yet tinged with something guilt, perhaps, or fear. The scratch on the desk nagged at her, as did the diary's absence. Had Margaret seen more than she claimed, or done more than she could bear to confess? In St. Mary Mead, a quiet girl had once hidden a stolen ring out of loyalty to a friend, and Miss Marple wondered if Margaret's silence hid a similar act as she settled by the guest house fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. Miss Marple thoughts turned to the web of motives surrounding Clara's death. Leonard's envy, Evelyn's fear, Grayson's ambition, and now Margaret's quiet grief. Tress was a thread, but the diary was the needle that could stitch them together. Her next step, she decided, would be to revisit Clara's flat alone. to search for the small clues the police had overlooked. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced hairpin had once solved a theft, and Miss Marple was certain that London, too, held its secrets in the smallest details. Chapter 6. The Diary's Shadow. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle as Miss Jane Marple stepped from her Bloomsbury guest house, her umbrella a small shield against the damp London air. The city's grey streets, slick with wet, seemed to mirror the elusive nature of Clara Henshaw's death, each clue slipping just out of reach like raindrops on cobblestones. Her meeting with Margaret Poole had left her with a sense of the young artist's quiet turmoil. Her halting answers and that haunting sketch of Clara hinting at a bond tinged with unspoken truths. The missing diary, that silent witness to Clara's secrets, loomed larger in Miss Marple's mind, its absence a puzzle as troubling as the journalist's death. Today she resolved to return to Clara's flat alone, to search for the small details that the police, in their haste, might have overlooked. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced button had once unravelled a theft, and Miss Marple was certain that Clara's home held similar keys to the truth. Inspector Raymond West met her at the flat, his face drawn with the fatigue of a case that refused to resolve. "Aunt Jane, you're tireless," he said, unlocking the door to Clara's second-floor apartment. "The Yard's ready to close this as suicide, but I trust your instincts. If there's something here, you'll find it." His voice held a note of hope, but Miss Marple's serene smile masked her own determination. She stepped inside, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm, and surveyed the room with fresh eyes. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and ink, the clutter of Clara's desk unchanged since her last visit. Papers spilled across its surface, the typewriter silent. The photograph on the mantel, a reminder of the four suspects: editor, source, rival, roommate, each bound to Clara by ambition, fear, or loyalty. Miss Marple approached the desk, her fingers brushing the faint scratch she'd noticed before, a jagged line in the oak that spoke of haste or struggle. "This mark," she said, almost to herself. "It's curious, isn't it, Raymond? As if something heavy was dragged across it." She knelt, her eyes level with the surface, and peered at the wood's grain. A tiny splinter caught her attention, wedged in the scratch, its edge darkened not with dirt, but with something that gleamed faintly, like wax or polish. She thought of a St. Mary Mead carpenter who'd left a similar mark while hiding a stolen watch. The clue overlooked until she'd pointed it out. Raymond crouched beside her, his brow furrowed. Could be from her typewriter or a book, he suggested, but Miss Marple shook her head, her mind already elsewhere. "The diary, perhaps," she murmured. "Clara kept it close, you said. If it was here, on this desk, and someone took it." Her voice trailed off, her eyes scanning the room for other signs of disturbance. The police had found no evidence of a struggle, only the bottle of sleeping pills by Clara's bed, yet Miss Marple's instincts told her otherwise. Suicide was tidy, predictable. This felt chaotic, deliberate. She moved to the mantel, studying the photograph again. Clara's vibrant smile contrasted with Victor Grayson's stern gaze, Evelyn Moore's nervous posture, Lena Tate's sharp features, and Margaret Poole's quiet reserve. "These four," she said to Raymond, "they were her world, weren't they? Her editor, her source, her rival, her roommate. One of them knows where that diary went." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, recalling a St. Mary Mead. Grocer Hood hidden a pilfered cash box, his guilt betrayed by a nervous glance at a photograph. Raymond nodded. his hands in his pockets. Clara was careful, Aunt Jane. She never left the diary unattended. She told her sister it was her lifeline, names, dates, conversations she couldn't publish yet. If someone took it, they knew its value. He paused, his voice lowering. Thorn Industries is the key, I think. Her last story was about there. Fraud offshore accounts, bribes to officials. The diary would have had proof, enough to ruin them. Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the rain tapping the windows. And ruin others, perhaps, she said, her mind turning to her suspects. Victor Grayson, with his locked drawer and polished ambition, might have feared Clara's story would damage the Clarion's reputation. Evelyn Moore, her nervous source, had admitted to giving Clara documents, her damp coat and trembling hands, suggesting a deeper involvement. Leonard Tate's envy was palpable, his quick alibi masking a hunger for Clara's success. And Margaret Poole, with her vague answers and that stark canvas, seemed to carry a quiet guilt. Each had a motive, but the diary's shadow fell heaviest on the truth. She moved to Clara's bedroom, its stark simplicity a contrast to the cluttered sitting room. The bed was neatly made, the bottle of sleeping pills still on the bedside table, its label crisp and unblemished. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she examined it, noting the absence of fingerprints, a detail the police had attributed to Clara's careful handling, but one that struck her as odd. In St. Mary Mead, a chemist's assistant had once wiped a bottle clean to hide his theft, and Miss Marple wondered if this bottle, too, held a secret. She opened the wardrobe, finding Clara's clothes neatly hung, but her fingers paused on. A scarf, dark green silk, its edge frayed as if caught on something sharp. Curious, she murmured, tucking the observation away. Returning to the sitting room, she studied the corkboard above the desk, where clippings and notes were pinned in a haphazard web. One scrap caught her torn piece of paper with the words Thorn Ledger scrawled in Clara's hand, the ink smudged as if written in haste. Miss Marple's heart quickened, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead letter that had solved a mystery with a single misplaced word. Raymond, dear, she said, pointing to the note, this may be important. If Clara was writing about thorns, ledgers, the diary would have held the details, names, figures, perhaps even a source within the company. Raymond examined the note, his expression grim. Evelyn Moore worked at Thorn, he said. She'd have access to those ledgers. But she swears she only gave Clara documents, not names, and she claims she was home the night Clara died. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts weaving through the clues. People often claim to be where they're not, she said softly. In my village, a young woman once said she was at a dance, but her muddy shoes told a different story. Evelyn's coat was damp, you said, on a night with no rain. And this scratch, she gestured to the desk. It suggests someone moved quickly, perhaps in a panic. Raymond's eyes widened. You think the diary was taken that night, but there's no sign of a break-in, no struggle. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gleaming with quiet certainty. Not all struggles leave marks, Raymond. In St. Mary Mead, a theft was once solved by a single broken thread. The diary's absence is a mark of its own, don't you think? She moved to the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked street. Someone came here, someone Clara knew. They took the diary, perhaps to protect themselves, perhaps to protect something greater. Raymond rubbed his chin, his frustration evident. But who? Grayson's alibi is solid. Dozen saw him at the Savoy. Leonard was at that press conference, ticket stub and all. Margaret claims she was at a gallery, and Evelyn says she was home. They all have stories, Aunt Jane. And stories, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, are like knitting patterns. They seem perfect until you find the dropped stitch. She tucked her needles away, her mind already turning to her next step. I'd like to speak with Evelyn again, Raymond. There's something in her manner that doesn't quite fit. And perhaps a visit to Thorn Industries to see what whispers I can catch. As Raymond locked the flat, Miss Marple paused on the stairs, her eyes lingering on the photograph one last time. The diary's shadow stretched across each face. Ambition, Evelyn's fear, Leonard's envy, Margaret's silence. One of them, she was certain, had crossed a line to keep Clara's secrets buried. In St. Mary Mead, a missing ledger had once led to a confession, and Miss Marple knew that Clara's diary, or its absence, would do the same. The rain fell harder as she stepped into the street, her umbrella raised, her resolve as steady as her knitting needles, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery. Chapter 7. A corporate conspiracy. The London drizzle had given way to a faint, watery sunlight by the time Miss Jane Marple stepped from a cab outside the imposing headquarters of Thorn Industries, a towering edifice of glass and steel that loomed over the city like a monument to wealth. Her visit to Clara Henshaw's flat had sharpened her focus. The scratch on the desk and the torn note about Thorn Ledger, pointing to a scandal that had cost the young journalist her life. The missing diary, that elusive thread in the tangled skein of Clara's death, seemed to lead here to the heart of a corporate empire. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, felt a familiar stir of curiosity, not unlike the one she'd felt when unraveling a village intrigue in St. Mary Mead. Power, she knew, bred secrets, and secrets bred desperation qualities, as common in London's boardrooms as in her quiet hamlet, posing as a curious pensioner researching local businesses for a parish newsletterer. Ruse that had served her well in the past. Miss Marple secured an appointment with a junior clerk at Thorn Industries. The lobby was a cavern of marble and chrome, its polished surfaces reflecting the hurried steps of men in suits and women in crisp blouses. A young receptionist, her smile as bright as her red lipstick, led Miss Marple to a small office where a clerk named Mr. Jenkins awaited. He was a slight man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous habit of adjusting his tie, not unlike a St. Mary Mead shop assistant who'd once fidgeted when questioned about a missing ledger. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Jenkins," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with a serene smile. Her knitting needles emerged, their soft clicking a soothing contrast to the office's sterile hum. "I'm writing a little piece for my village newsletter about London's great companies. Thorn Industries, I'm told, is quite influential." Jenkins blinked, clearly puzzled by her presence, but eager to please. "We're a leader in manufacturing and trade," he said, his voice rehearsed. "Our work spans countenance steel, shipping, investments. I'm happy to provide a brochure, Miss Marple, is it?" He reached for a glossy pamphlet, but Miss Marple's eyes were on his hands, noting the faint ink stains on his fingers, a detail that reminded her of a St. Mary Mead clerk who'd betrayed his theft with a smudged ledger. "How fascinating," she said, her tone warm but her gaze sharp. "I understand a young journalist, Clara Henshaw, was writing about your company. Such a tragedy, her passing. Did you know her, perhaps?" Jenkins's tie adjusting quickened, his eyes darting to the door. "Clara Henshaw. I read her articles in the Clarion. She was asking questions about our finances, but I never met her." We get reporters all the time, curious types, you know. His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his shoulders stiffened, much like A.S. Mary Mead, grocer, who'd denied selling tainted goods until pressed. Of course, she said, her needles clicking steadily. But Clara's stories were quite bold, weren't they? I heard she had a diary filled with details about her investigations. It's missing now, I'm told. Such a pity. Her voice was gentle, but her words were deliberate, testing the air like a gardener probing soil for roots. Jenkins's face paled slightly, his fingers fumbling with a pen. A diary. I wouldn't know anything about that. Our records are open to scrutiny, well within reason. Miss Henshaw's questions were intrusive, but we cooperated. His words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, not unlike a St. Mary Mead tailor who'd hidden a client's secret behind a practiced smile. She leaned forward, her smile disarming. You must hear all sorts of whispers in a place like this, Mr. Jenkins. In my village, a clerk once overheard a conversation that solved a mystery. Have you heard anything about Thorne's accounts, offshore dealings, perhaps, or payments? That raised eyebrows. Jenkins's pen slipped, rolling across the desk. Offshore accounts, he said, his voice rising slightly. That's above my level, I'm afraid. I just handle correspondence, minor transactions. But there are rumors. You know how offices are. Some say the higher-ups move money to places like the Caymans, to avoid taxes. And there was talk of payments to regulators, but it's just gossip. He adjusted his tie again, his eyes avoiding hers. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away his words. In St. Mary Mead, gossip had once led to a stolen will, and she sensed Thorne's rumors held a similar weight. You're very kind to indulge an old woman's curiosity, she said, rising. Might I trouble you for a look at your filing room? For my newsletter, you understand, a glimpse of how a great company keeps its records. Jenkins hesitated, then nodded, perhaps relieved to shift the conversation. He led her to a cavernous room lined with steel cabinets, their drawers labeled with dates and codes. The air smelled of paper and dust, and Miss Marple's eyes scanned the labels, noting one marked overseas accounts, 1900, e 24 menos 25. She thought of Evelyn Moore, Clara's source, who'd worked in such a room, her nervous hands passing documents. To a journalist whose diary had vanished. How meticulous, Miss Marple said, her voice admiring. Miss Evelyn Moore, I believe, must work in a place like this. Did she ever mention Clara? Jenkins froze, his hand on a drawer. Evelyn, she's a secretary here, yes. Quiet, keeps to herself. I don't think she knew Miss Henshaw personally, but, well, she's been jumpy lately, ever since that reporter's death. His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the drawer, as if it held something he feared. She thanked him and left, her mind buzzing with the clerk's revelations. Thorne Industries was a fortress of secrets, its ledgers hiding truths that Clara had sought to expose. The diary, she was certain, had contained proof names, figures, perhaps even Jenkins's own unwitting contributions. Had Evelyn, terrified of exposure, taken it to protect herself? Or had someone higher, perhaps even Thorne's elusive CEO, acted to silence Clara? Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead banker who destroyed a ledger to hide his fraud, his guilt betrayed by a trembling hand. Back at her guest house, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as she turned over the dais. Clues. Jenkins's nervousness, the labelled drawer, and the whispers of offshore accounts pointed to a scandal of vast proportions. Clara's diary, with its record of Thorne's misdeeds, would have been a threat to many of Ellen, whose documents fueled the investigation; Grayson, whose paper stood to lose if sued; Leonard, whose envy might have driven him to steal Clara's work; or even Margaret, whose quiet grief hid something deeper. The scratch on Clara's desk, the torn note, and the diary's absence formed a pattern. One Miss Marple was determined to complete. She resolved to revisit Evelyn Moore, whose fear seemed to grow with each encounter. The damp coat, the stained cuff, and her vague alibi nagged at Miss Marple's mind, like a St. Mary Mead seamstress whose muddy shoes had betrayed a nighttime errand. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Thorne Industries was the heart of Clara's story, and the diary was its pulse. Someone had stopped that pulse, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would find them, just as she had found a St. Mary Mead thief, with a single misplaced thread. Chapter 8. The Alibis Cracked Her. Late afternoon light filtered through the grimy windows of Miss Jane Marple's Bloomsbury guest house, casting faint shadows across the worn carpet as she sat with her knitting, the pale pink shawl growing steadily under her nimble fingers. The visit to Thorne Industries had sharpened her sense of the vast web. Clara Henshaw had dared to unravel a corporate scandal of offshore accounts and whispered bribes, its threads woven tightly into the missing diary. The nervous clerk, Mr. Jenkins, had unwittingly confirmed the stakes, his fidgeting hands and guarded words echoing the unease Miss Marple had seen in a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd hidden a pilfered ledger. Yet it was Leonard Tate, Clara's ambitious rival, whose sharp-edged envy lingered in her thoughts. His press conference alibi, backed by a crumpled ticket stub, seemed airtight, but Miss Marple, with her village-bred instinct for human nature, sensed a flaw. In St. Mary Mead, a young man's alibi for a stolen bicycle had crumbled under scrutiny, and she suspected Leonard's might do the same. Determined to test his story, Miss Marple arranged to meet Raymond at a small cafe near the Home Office, where the press conference had taken place on the night of Clara's death. The cafe, a cramped affair with steamed windows and the clatter of teacups, was frequented by civil servants and journalists, its tables alive with the hum of gossip. Raymond arrived promptly, his face etched with the strain of a case that refused to resolve. "Aunt Jane," he said, sliding into the booth opposite her, "you're relentless. The yard's all but given up, but you're still chasing shadows. What's on your mind today?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, her knitting needles clicking softly as she poured tea. "Shadows, Raymond, often hide the truth. Mr. Tate's alibi interests me. He was at a press conference, he says, with dozens of witnesses. But in my village, a lad once claimed to be at a fair, yet slipped away to cause mischief. I'd like to speak to someone who was there, perhaps a waiter or a reporter, to confirm his story." Raymond nodded, his eyes brightening. "I can help. With that, there's a waiter at the Home Office canteen who served the event. I'll arrange for you to meet him." He paused, stirring his tea. "Leonard's a sharp one, Aunt Jane. Ambitious, clever, but bitter. If he thought Clara's diary could give him an edge, he might have taken a risk." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind drifting to a St. Mary Mead tailor who'd coveted a rival's designs, his envy leading to a theft that unraveled under gentle questioning. "Ambition can be a dangerous thing," she said softly. Let us see if Mr. Tate's ambition outran his alibi. The Home Office canteen, a utilitarian space with linoleum floors and the faint smell of boiled cabbage, was quiet when Miss Marple arrived later that day. The waiter, a wiry young man named Tom with a quick smile and a Cockney accent, was polishing glasses behind the counter. "You're the lady asking about the press do," he said, eyeing her curiously. "Inspector, Wes said you're looking into that reporter's death. Clara Henshaw, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag resting on the counter. "Indeed, Mr. Tom, you served at the Home Office press conference the night Miss Henshaw died, I believe. I'm curious about one of the journalists, Mr. Leonard Tate. Do you recall him?" Tom's grin widened, his hands still busy with the glasses. "Oh, I remember him. Sharp dresser, bit of a swagger, kept to himself, mostly scribbling in a notebook. He was there, all right, but he didn't stay long. Left early, maybe an hour into the thing. Looked agitated, like he had somewhere else to be." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Mind you, I overheard him on the phone outside, talking to someone about a big story. Sounded like he was in a rush." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her smile remained serene. "How very interesting," she said, her needles clicking as she drew them out. "And you're certain he left? Early did he return?" Tom shook his head. "Not that I saw. The conference dragged on till 10, but he was gone by 8, maybe past. I noticed 'cause he left his coffee untouched, and he'd been nursing it like it was gold." He chuckled, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the timeline. Clara had been found dead around 9, the sleeping pills suggesting a swift end. If Leonard had left the conference early, he could have reached her flat in time enough to argue, to act, to take the diary. "Thank you, Mr. Tom," she said, tucking her knitting away. "You've been most helpful." As she left the canteen, the city's bustle seemed to fade, her thoughts focused on Leonard's cracked alibi. In St. Mary Mead, a young woman's claim of being at a dance had faltered when a neighbour saw her slip away, and Miss Marple suspected Leonard's story was similarly frayed. She arranged to meet Leonard again, this time at his small office at the Clarion, a cramped space cluttered with newspapers and cigarette stubs. He greeted her with a wary smile, his sharp features tense. "Miss Marple," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I thought we'd covered everything. What brings you back?" His tone was casual, but his fingers resumed their familiar drumming, a rhythm Miss Marple recognized as a sign of unease. She settled across from him, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Just a few loose ends, Mr. Tate," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "Your alibi for the night Clara died at the press conference. It's very thorough, with that ticket stub and all. But I spoke to a waiter who recalls you. Leaving early, looking agitated. I wonder if you might clarify that for me." Leonard's smile froze, his fingers pausing mid-drum. "Early," he said, his voice a shade too sharp. "I stayed till the end. The waiter's mistaken. Those events are a blur, reporters in and out. Waiters barely notice." He lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the dim office. Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hand, not unlike a St. Mary Mead grocer who trembled when caught in a lie about a missing cash box. "Perhaps," she said, her eyes meeting his, "but he was quite certain. Said you were on the phone, talking about a big story. It's curious, don't you think, that you'd leave such an event early, especially with your ambition to outshine Clara?" Leonard's laugh was brittle, his eyes narrowing. "I was chasing a lead, that's all. Got a call from an editor at the Dispatch. They're offering me a job better than this place. I stepped out to talk. Didn't want Grayson overhearing. Nothing to do with Clara. He exhaled a plume of smoke, his posture stiff. You're barking up the wrong tree, Miss Marple. If you want answers, look at Evelyn Moore. She was feeding Clara secrets, then got cold feet. Scared types like her do desperate things. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind filing away his deflection. A job offer, she said, her tone musing. How fortunate. Did this editor ask you to bring something, perhaps? A story, or a diary's contents, to seal the deal? Leonard's face reddened, his cigarette ash dropping to the desk. That's absurd, he snapped. I didn't need Clara's diary to get ahead. I've got my own sources, my own stories. She was reckless, digging into Thorn Industries. Someone there shut her up, not me. His words were fierce, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in his eyes. Like a St. Mary Mead carpenter who denied sabotaging a rival's work until the evidence was laid bare. She rose, her smile unchanged. Thank you, Mr. Tate. You've given me much to think about. As she left the office, the clatter of typewriters fading behind her, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Leonard's cracked alibi. His early departure, the phone call, the talk of a big story, each was a thread in the pattern of Clara's death. Had he gone to her flat, seeking the diary to claim her scoop? The scratch on the desk, the torn note about Thorne's ledger, and now this gap in his story pointed to a man whose envy might have turned deadly. Back at her guest house, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving with quiet purpose. Leonard's ambition, Evelyn's fear, Grayson's control, and Margaret's silence formed a web with the diary at its center. Her next step, she decided, would be to press Margaret further, to probe the quiet artist's vague alibi and haunted sketches. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced hairpin had once solved a theft, and Miss Marple was certain that Clara's flat held similar clues, waiting to unravel the truth of the missing diary. Chapter 9. The roommate's confession. The soft patter of rain had returned to London's streets, cloaking Bloomsbury in a fine mist as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Clara Henshaw's flat on Russell Square. The revelations of the past. Days Leonard Tate's cracked alibi, the whispers of Thorn Industries fraud, and the persistent shadow of the missing diary had woven a complex pattern in her mind, not unlike the intricate lace shawl taking shape under her knitting needles. Her encounter with Margaret Poole, Clara's quiet roommate, had left her with a sense of the young artist's unspoken burden, her vague responses and that stark, jagged canvas hinting at a deeper connection to Clara's fate. Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead instinct for the truths hidden in silences, resolved to press Margaret further to find the thread that might unravel the mystery. In her village, a shy girl's hesitant confession had once solved a theft, and Miss Marple suspected Margaret's reticence held a similar key. The Georgian building stood as before, its windows dark against the evening gloom. Miss Marple climbed the creaking stairs, her knitting bag a steady weight on her arm, and knocked softly. Margaret opened the door, her paint-splattered smock replaced by a plain grey dress, her auburn hair loose and framing a face pale with strain. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't expecting you again." Her hazel eyes darted past Miss Marple to the empty hallway, a gesture that reminded the old lady of a St. Mary Mead seamstress hood, checked for eavesdroppers before admitting to a stolen brooch. "I shan't keep you long, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile as warm as a summer afternoon. "But I've been thinking about Clara, and I felt we might talk a little more. May I come in?" Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside, leading Miss Marple into the familiar sitting room. The clutter of Clara's desk remained untouched, the photograph on the mantel a silent reminder of the 4 suspects bound to her death. Margaret's canvases leaned against the wall, their colours muted but restless, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the abstract piece she'd noticed before, its jagged lines seeming to pulse with a hidden story. She settled into the worn armchair by the window, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar, soft clicking. "You've been so kind to help, Miss Poole," she began, her voice gentle but deliberate. "Clara's death must weigh heavily on you, living so close. I've been wondering about her last day. You said she was on edge, checking the locks, fearing someone was watching her. Did you see her diary that day, perhaps on the desk?" Margaret's hands twisted together, her fingers stained with faint traces of paint. I think so," she said, her voice faltering. "It was there, on the desk, that morning. The green leather one, with the clasp. She was writing in it, as always. I didn't pay much attention. I was working on a sketch." She gestured vaguely to a sketchbook on the table, its pages closed. Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided the desk, not unlike a St. Mary Mead girl who'd shied away from a stolen ring she'd hidden. "And that night," Miss Marple continued, her needles moving steadily, "you were at a gallery in Soho, you said. But when you returned, the diary was gone, wasn't it? Did you notice anything else? Anything out of place?" Margaret's lips trembled, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know," she whispered. "When I got back, the police were here. They'd found Clara in her room. I didn't look at the desk. Everything was a blur." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple saw the glimmer of tears, quickly blinked away. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow whose tears had masked a deeper guilt, her confession spilling out under gentle pressure. "You poor dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but her eyes sharp. "It must have been dreadful, but you see, the diary is so important. Clara wrote everything in it, names, secrets about Thorn Industries. If it was taken, someone wanted those secrets hidden. In my village, a young woman once hid a letter to protect a friend, but she told the truth in the end. Is there anything you haven't told me, Miss Poole?" Margaret's hands froze, her breath catching. She looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve. I did see the diary," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "That night, before I left for the gallery, it was on the desk, open. Clara was writing, frantic, like she was running out of time. I asked her what was wrong, but she just said, 'It's bigger than I thought.' I didn't press high, never did." Her words came faster now, as if a dam had broken. "When I got back, after the police came, it was gone. I swear I didn't. Take it, Miss Marple." "I wouldn't. I couldn't." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady but kind. "Of course, my dear, but you're certain it was gone? You didn't, perhaps, move it to keep it safe?" Her voice was soft, but the question was pointed, testing the edges of Margaret's confession. Margaret shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I didn't touch it. But I felt something was wrong. Clara was so scared that day, talking about someone following her. I should have stayed, but I went to the gallery. I thought she'd be fine." Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands clenched, not unlike a St. Mary Mead artist who'd painted a canvas to mask her guilt over a betrayal. She rose, moving to the desk, her eyes lingering on the scratch she'd noticed before. "This mark," she said, almost to herself. "It suggests something was moved in a hurry. The diary, perhaps, or something else." She turned to Margaret, her smile gentle but unyielding. "Your sketch of Clara in her room, it's very striking. You captured her so well. Was it done before or after her death?" Margaret's face paled, her hands trembling. "After," she whispered. "The next day, I couldn't sleep, so I drew her, to remember her." Her eyes darted to the canvas in the corner, its jagged lines seeming to writhe in the dim light. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead girl whose embroidery had betrayed her anxiety after a theft, each stitch a confession of sorts. "You loved her, didn't you?" Miss Marple said softly, her voice free of judgment. "It's hard to lose someone so vibrant, so full of purpose. Sometimes we keep things back to protect them, or ourselves." Margaret's tears fell freely now, her shoulders shaking. "She was my friend," she said, her voice raw. "I didn't want her to get hurt, but I didn't know how to help. I should have stayed that night. I should have." She trailed off, burying her face in her hands. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her mind filing away the confession. Margaret's grief was genuine, but her vague alibi and the timing of that sketch nagged at her like a St. Mary Mead baker, whose hurried baking had hidden a stolen recipe. Had Margaret returned earlier than she claimed, seen something she couldn't bear to admit, the diary open on the desk, would have been a temptation or a threat to someone in the flat that night. "Thank you, Miss Poole," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "You've been very brave. I may call again, if you'll allow it." As she stepped into the rainy street, her umbrella raised, her thoughts turned over Margaret's words. The diary's presence that night, Clara's fear and the artist's guilt formed a pattern, but the missing piece, the diary itself, remained elusive. Had Margaret, in a moment of panic, taken it to protect Clara's memory? Or had another, with darker motives, slipped into the flat? Back at her guest house, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as she wove the day's clues into the fabric of the mystery. Margaret's confession was a step closer to the truth, but the diary's shadow loomed larger, its secrets tied to Thorn Industries and the 4 suspects circling Clara's life. Her next move, she decided, would be to confront Evelyn Moore again, to press the nervous source whose damp coat and stained cuff suggested a presence at Clara's flat. In St. Mary Mead, a single muddy footprint had once solved a theft, and Miss Marple was certain that London's secrets, too, would yield to her patient scrutiny. Chapter 10. The source's fear. The London dawn broke with a pale, reluctant light, filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's Bloomsbury guest house and casting delicate patterns across the worn rug. Her knitting lay neatly folded. Beside her, the pale pink shawl, a testament to her patient hands, but her mind was far from restful. Margaret Poole's tearful confession had sharpened the outlines of the mystery surrounding Clara Henshaw's death. The artist's halting words, an haunted sketch suggesting a guilt born of inaction rather than malice. Yet the missing diary, that silent key to Clara's secrets, remained the heart of the puzzle, its absence pointing to a deliberate act. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Evelyn Moore, the nervous source whose damp coat and stained cuff had lingered in her mind like a misplaced stitch in a St. Mary Mead quilt. Evelyn's fear, she sensed, held a truth that could unravel the case, and today she resolved to confront her once more. Inspector Raymond West had arranged a meeting at his office at Scotland Yard, a neutral ground where Evelyn might feel compelled to speak plainly. As Miss Marple stepped from a cab into the bustle of Whitehall, her umbrella tucked under her arm against the threat of rain, she felt the weight of the city's secrets pressing close. The Yard's stone facade loomed stern and unyielding, much like the truth she sought. Raymond greeted her in a cramped office, its walls lined with files and the air heavy with the scent of ink and tobacco. "Aunt Jane," he said, his voice tinged with both admiration and exasperation, "you're like a terrier with this case. Evelyn's agreed to come, but she's skittish. I hope you can get more out of her than I did." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her knitting bag a familiar weight as she settled into a chair. "People often say more than they intend, Raymond," she said, her needles emerging with their soft, steady clicking. "In my village, a young woman once hid a stolen letter out of fear, but her words betrayed her. Let us see what Miss Moore's fear reveals." Evelyn arrived promptly, her mousy brown hair pinned tightly, her grey coat now dry but still bearing that faint dark stain on the cuff. Her eyes, wide and wary, darted from Raymond to Miss Marple, as if seeking an escape. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "I've told you everything I know about Clara. I don't understand why you need to see me again." She sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, not unlike a St. Mary Mead typist who'd clutched her apron when questioned about a missing purse. Miss Marr were gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "You've been most helpful, my dear," she said, her needles moving steadily. "But there are a few points I'd like to clarify. You gave Clara documents about Thorn Industries, quite a risk, considering their power. You said you were home the night she died, yet a neighbor saw you out, your coat damp on a dry evening. And there's the matter of Clara's diary, which you knew held her proof. Can you tell me more about that night?" Evelyn's face drained of color, her hands tightening until her knuckles whitened. I was home," she stammered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "The neighbor must be mistaken. I didn't go to Clara's flat. I swear it." Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted the edge of her coat, a gesture that echoed a St. Mary Mead baker who'd lied about a stolen loaf until the truth spilled out. Miss Marple's tone remained soft, almost maternal. "It's a heavy burden, carrying such fear," she said. "In my village, a young man once hid a truth to protect his family, but it ate at him until he spoke. You were frightened, weren't you, Miss Moore? Frightened that Clara's story would expose you, ruin your life." Evelyn's lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears. "I was terrified," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Clara was going to publish my name. I begged her not to, but she said the truth mattered more. I went to her flat that night to talk, to make her understand." Her words came faster now, a flood breaking through a crumbling dam. "She was alive when I got there, writing in her diary. We argued she was so stubborn, said Thorn would come for me if I didn't stand with her. I left, I swear, but when I heard she was dead, I went back later, after the police were called. The diary was on the desk open. I took it and burned it. I had to protect myself." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady but kind. "You burned it," she repeated, her voice free of judgment, "to keep your name out of Clara's story. But tell me, my dear, when you first went to her flat, was Clara truly well? Or was there someone else there?" Evelyn's tears spilled over, her hands shaking. She was alone, she insisted. She was upset, but alive. I didn't hurt her, Miss Marple. I couldn't. But when I went back, after the police, the diary was still there. I panicked. I took it and burned it in my fireplace. I didn't want anyone to know I'd been her. Source. Her voice broke and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing Miss Margot gently, recalling a St. Mary Mead clerk whose confession had unraveled a theft when pressed with quiet persistence. And your coat, she said, her tone musing. It was damp, wasn't it? A neighbor saw you, and there was no rain that night. Can you explain that, my dear? Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. I spilled tea on it, she said, her voice faltering. At home, after I left Clara's, I was nervous, clumsy, that's all. Her words were rushed, and Miss Marple noted the inconsistency, not unlike a St. Mary Mead girl whose story about a broken vase had shifted under scrutiny. Tea did not explain the stain, nor the neighbor's account of her leaving late, coat damp in the dry night. Raymond leaned forward, his voice firm. Miss Moore, you're admitting to destroying evidence. That's serious. If you know more about Clara's death, about who else was there, you need to tell us now. Evelyn shook her head, her sobs quieting but her fear palpable. I've told you everything, she said. I took the diary, but I didn't hurt her. I didn't see anyone else. Please, you have to believe me. Her eyes pleaded, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the timeline. If Evelyn had argued with Clara, left, and returned later to find her dead, someone else could have entered the flat in the interim, someone who forced the sleeping pills upon her. The scratch on the desk, the torn note about Thorne's ledger, and now Evelyn's confession pointed to a struggle. A desperate act to silence Clara and her secrets. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away, her smile gentle but her mind alert. Thank you, Miss Moore. You've been very brave to tell us this. We shan't trouble you further for now. As she and Raymond stepped into the corridor, the weight of Evelyn's words settled over her. The burned diary was a loss, but its destruction confirmed its power proof of Thorne's crimes, names that could ruin lives. Evelyn's fear had driven her to destroy it, but had it also driven her to more? The damp coat, the stained cuff, and her shifting story suggested a presence at Clara's flat closer to the time of death than she admitted. Back at her guest house, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her needles clicking as she wove the day's clues into the fabric of the mystery. Evelyn's confession was a thread, but the pattern was incomplete. Leonard's cracked alibi, Margaret's quiet guilt, Grayson's ambition all circled the diary's absence, but the truth of Clara's death lay in the moments Evelyn had not confessed. In St. Mary Mead, a muddy footprint had once led to a thief, and Miss Marple was certain that Evelyn's damp coat held a similar truth. Her next step, she decided, would be to revisit Clara's flat, to search for the smallest clue that might confirm Evelyn's presence or another's at the fatal hour. The rain fell softly outside, and Miss Marple's resolve burned bright, ready to pull the final threads of the diary's shadow into the light. Chapter 11. The final clue. The London morning was cloaked in a thin fog, the kind that softened the edges of Bloomsbury's Georgian buildings and lent an air of mystery to the bustling streets. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under, her arm stepped from her guest house with a quiet determination, her thoughts as sharp as the needles she carried. Evelyn Moore's tearful confession had brought the mystery of Clara Henshaw's death into sharper focus. Yet the burned diary and Evelyn's faltering story about her damp coat left gaps in the pattern Miss Marple was weaving. The scratch on Clara's desk, the torn note about Thorn Ledger, and the faint stain on Evelyn's cuff were threads in a tapestry of deceit. And Miss Marple sensed the truth was near, waiting in the small details that others overlooked. In St. Mary Mead, a single misplaced hairpin had once solved a theft, and she was certain that Clara's flat held a similar clue, a final key to unravel the murder. Inspector Raymond West had granted her access to the flat once more, though his patience was wearing thin. "Aunt Jane," he'd said over breakfast, his voice tinged with exasperation, "the Yard's ready to close this case. Evelyn's admitted to taking the diary, and the pills point to suicide. You're chasing ghosts." Miss Marple's serene smile had been her only reply, her mind already fixed on the desk's scratch and the possibility that Evelyn's confession concealed a darker act. She arrived at the Russell Square flat alone, the key cool in her hand, and stepped into the familiar chaos of Clara's sitting room, where papers still spilled across the desk and the mantel's photograph watched in silent judgment. The air was heavy with dust, the silence broken only by the distant hum of London traffic. Miss Marple moved to the desk, her eyes drawn to the scratch she'd noticed before a jagged line in the oak. Its edges splintered as if something heavy had been dragged in haste. She knelt, her fingers tracing the mark, and her gaze fell on a tiny shred of paper caught in a crack, barely visible unless one looked closely. With careful precision, she teased it out using a hairpin from her bag, a trick she'd learned in St. Mary Mead when retrieving a lost bead. The fragment was no larger than a postage stamp, its ink smudged but legible. "Thorn's Ledger M." Confirmed. Miss Marple's heart quickened, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead letter whose torn corner had betrayed a thief's identity. "E.M.," she murmured, her voice soft as the fog outside. Evelyn Moore. The fragment confirmed what she'd suspected. Clara's diary held proof of Thorn Industries' fraud, with Evelyn as the key source. But had Evelyn, terrified of exposure, acted to silence Clara before burning the diary? The damp coat, the stained cuff, and her presence at the flat suggested more than a panicked theft. Miss Marple tucked the fragment into her bag, her thoughts turning to the bedroom, where the bottle of sleeping pills still stood on the bedside table. She examined the bottle closely, noting its pristine label, untouched by fingerprints at detail. The police had dismissed as Clara's caution, but which struck Miss Marple as deliberate. In St. Mary Mead, a chemist's assistant had once wiped a bottle clean to hide his tampering, and she wondered if this bottle had been similarly handled. She opened the wardrobe again, her fingers brushing the frayed green scarf she'd noticed before. Its edge, caught on something sharp, bore a faint smear of dark wax, like that used to seal a diary's clasp. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her mind piecing together the scene, a struggle, perhaps as someone wrested the diary from Clara's hands, leaving the scratch and the frayed scarf in their wake. Returning to the sitting room, she studied the corkboard, where the torn note about Thorn Ledger still hung. The smudged ink matched the fragments, suggesting it had been written in haste, perhaps as Clara realized her danger. Miss Marple's needles emerged, their clicking a steady rhythm, as she sat by the window, her thoughts weaving through the clues. Evelyn's confession placed her at the flat twice, once to argue, once to take the diary, but the damp coat and stained cuff suggested she'd been there during the fatal hour, not after. The absence of fingerprints, the wax on the scarf, and the scratch on the desk painted a picture of a desperate act, not a suicide. Miss Marple's gaze fell on Margaret's canvas in the corner, its jagged lines a stark reflection of grief or guilt. She recalled the artist's tearful admission, her claim of seeing the diary that night, her vague alibi of the Soho gallery. Had Margaret returned earlier, witnessed something she couldn't confess? Or was Evelyn's fear the true motive, her panic driving her to force the pills on Clara before burning the diary to hide her role? Leonard's cracked alibi and Grayson's ambition lingered in her mind, but Evelyn's presence at the flat, confirmed by the neighbour and the fragment, made her the linchpin. She rose, her knitting tucked away, and made her way to Raymond's office to share her findings. He listened intently as she described the paper fragment and the wax-smeared scarf, his brow furrowing. "It's compelling, Aunt Jane," he said, "but Evelyn's confession only admits to taking the diary. We need more to prove murder." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene but her resolve unyielding. "In St. Mary Mead, a single thread unravelled a theft," she said. "This fragment is our thread, Raymond. It places Evelyn at the heart of Clara's story and her death." As she left the yard, the fog lifting to reveal a pale sun, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the final confrontation. The diary was gone, its secrets burned, but the clues in Clara's flat the scratch. The fragment, the scarf pointed to a truth that could not be hidden. Evelyn's fear had driven her to destroy evidence, but had it pushed her further to silence Clara forever? In St. Mary Mead, a muddy footprint had once led to a confession, and Miss Marple was certain that London's secrets, too, would yield to her patient scrutiny. Her next step, she decided, would be to gather the suspects, to lay bare the pattern. She'd woven and watched their faces for the final stitch of truth. Chapter 12. The truth revealed. The fog had lifted from London's streets, leaving a crisp evening air that sharpened the outlines of Bloomsbury's Georgian terraces as Miss Jane Marple stepped from her guest house, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm. The clues she had gathered, the scratch on Clara Henshaw's desk, the torn diary fragment, the wax-smeared scarf, and Evelyn Moore's faltering confession had woven a pattern as clear as the pale pink. Shawl now complete in her bag. Death was no suicide, and the missing diary, burned by Evelyn to hide her role as the journalist's source, held the key to a corporate scandal at Thorn Industries. Yet it was the small details, like those that had solved a St. Mary Mead theft with a single misplaced hairpin, that pointed to Evelyn's deeper guilt. Miss Marple, her resolve as steady as her knitting needles, had asked Inspector Raymond West to gather the suspects Victor Grayson, Evelyn Moore, Leonard Tate, and Margaret Poole for a final reckoning at his Scotland Yard office. The office was a stark contrast to the cosy chaos of Clara's flat, its bare walls and polished desk lit by the cold glare of electric lamps. Raymond stood by the window, his face a mix of skepticism and anticipation, while the four suspects sat in a tense semicircle. Victor Grayson, his steel-grey hair immaculate, exuded the controlled impatience of a man unused to scrutiny. Leonard Tate, his sharp features taut, drummed his fingers on his knee, his eyes darting with restless energy. Margaret Poole, her auburn hair loose and her hands clasped tightly, seemed to shrink into her chair, her gaze fixed on the floor. Evelyn Moore, pale and trembling, clutched her grey coat, its stained cuff hidden but not forgotten. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting bag at her side, observed them all, her serene smile masking the keen scrutiny of a St. Mary Mead spinster who had unravelled many a village secret. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty. "Clara Henshaw's death has puzzled us, but the truth, like a dropped stitch, always reveals itself in time. Her diary, filled with proof of Thorn Industries' crimes, was the heart of this tragedy. It's gone now, burned, but its shadow remains. Her eyes moved from face to face, noting Grayson's tightened jaw, Leonard's halted drumming, Margaret's flinch, and Evelyn's shudder. She drew the diary fragment from her bag, its smudged ink clear under the lamplight. This was found in Clara's desk, caught in a scratch that suggests a struggle, she said. It reads, Thorn's ledger E.M. confirmed. E.M. Evelyn Moore, Clara's source. The diary held proof of fraud offshore accounts, bribes that could have ruined Thorn and exposed those who aided Clara. Its theft was no accident. Grayson leaned forward, his voice sharp. This is preposterous, Miss Marple. Clara was reckless. Yes, but I had no reason to harm her. She was my best reporter. My alibi at the Savoy is solid, ask anyone. His eyes were steady, but Miss Marple noted the faint creases of strain. Like a St. Mary Mead banker who'd hidden fraud behind a polished facade. Leonard's laugh was brittle. You're wasting your time, he said, his fingers resuming their restless beat. I was at the press conference, ticket stub and all. Sure, I left early for a job offer, but I didn't go near Clara's flat. If anyone's guilty, it's Evelyn Shea admitted to burning the diary. His deflection was swift, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in his eyes. Not unlike a St. Mary Mead tailor who'd blamed another for his theft. Margaret's voice was barely audible. I didn't touch the diary, she whispered, her hands trembling. I was at the gallery, and when I came back, Clara was gone. I loved her, Miss Marple. I wouldn't hurt her. Her tears were genuine, but Miss Marple recalled the jagged canvas, its lines a mirror of guilt or grief. Evelyn's sob broke the silence, her face crumpling. I told you, I took the diary after she was dead, she said, her voice raw. I burned it to protect myself. Thorn would have destroyed me if my name came out, but I didn't kill her, swear it. Her hands clutched her coat, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the stained cuff, a detail that had nagged her like a St. Mary Mead seamstress's muddy shoes. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words were unyielding. Clara's diary held proof that threatened Thorn Industries and you. Miss Moore, you went to her flat that night, not just to talk, but to stop her. You argued, as you admitted, but it was more than an argument, wasn't it? The scratch on the desk, the wax on Clara's scarf-fit suggests a struggle. You were frightened, desperate to keep your name out of her story. You forced the sleeping pills upon her, then took the diary to burn its secrets. Evelyn's eyes widened, her breath catching. No, she gasped, but her voice faltered, her hands shaking violently. I didn't. I couldn't. Her words dissolved into sobs, and the room fell silent, the weight of her fear palpable. Miss Marple's gaze softened, recalling a St. Mary Mead baker who'd confessed to a theft when pressed with quiet certainty. The neighbour saw your coat. Damp on a dry night, Miss Marple continued, her tone kind but firm. The stain on your cuff wax, perhaps, from the diary's clasp. You were there when Clara died, not after. You acted alone, driven by fear of Thorn's wrath, to silence her and destroy the evidence. Evelyn's shoulders slumped, her sobs giving way to a broken whisper. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice barely audible. She was going to publish my name. I begged her, but she wouldn't listen. I pushed the pills at her, told her to calm down. She took them, but it was too many. I panicked, took the diary, burned it. I just wanted to be safe. Her confession hung in the air, a thread pulled loose from the fabric of lies. Raymond stepped forward, his face grim as he signaled for an officer to escort Evelyn away. Grayson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his ambition untouched by the truth. Leonard's fingers stilled, his eyes dark with relief or shame. Margaret's tears fell silently, her grief for Clara now unshadowed by suspicion. Miss Marple folded her hands, her shawl complete, its pattern as intricate as the mystery she'd unravelled, as she left the yard. The London night was clear, the stars faint above the city's glow. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead, where human nature, stripped of London's grandeur, was no less complex. A missing diary, a corporate scandal, a desperate act each, had its echo in the village scandals she'd solved. She hailed a cab, her knitting bag at her side, her faith in truth tempered but intact. Clara's secrets were laid bare, and the diary's shadow, though burned, had led to justice. In St. Mary Mead, a single thread had once solved a crime, and in London, Miss Marple had found her thread in the smallest clues, weaving them into the light of truth.